ask him a couple of questions so he can give you some background. Come on up, then I'll just let him turn over. How long have you been coming to fellowship?
So we've been coming here about 7 years.
7 years?
Yes.
Okay. And you've had your small group for what, 2 years now?
Yeah, about that, yeah.
You meet in Shepherdstown?
So we actually meet towards Charlestown.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Your degree
So,
is in science.
yes, I have 2 degrees in science. I have a bachelor's degree of biological sciences from the University of Nebraska and a PhD in biological sciences from the University of Missouri.
If you gave me a book, Science for Dummies, and it had a little graph in the start, you would take a pre-test, and then it would evaluate whether you should buy the book or not. I could write that book, and they would say, no way, Jose. Don't even buy the book. Science is always, it mystifies me. I can't understand what I can't see. And the periodic table, I think I'd have nightmares about that thing in college. I took as little science as I had to get through college, but wow, I had some good teachers. But you guys in the sciences are amazing. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I appreciate your love for the Lord. I mentioned before, when a Christian uses a Christian man for another man, when he uses a term, a good man, that speaks volumes. This is another good man. We're glad that he's here. We're glad that he's able to work with us. Science versus faith, science versus evolution. I'll let you pray and begin, okay? Thank you.
Okay, we'll bow our heads. Father God, we thank you for just being able to be here today, to gather in your name. We thank you so much for your greatest gift, your Son Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for us and rose again so that we would have new life. Lord, we just pray that our time here today would be edifying for us and glorifying of you. And Lord, we just pray that we would get wisdom and direction in our conversation, and that we would be kind with one another, but Lord, truthful too. And Lord, we just pray for your guidance in Jesus' name. Amen. So, as Bob was asking, yes, I have a couple of science degrees, and I actually got those degrees before becoming a Christian. So I feel like this is one topic I have somewhat unique perspective on. Not entirely unique. There's a lot of scientists with similar stories. And they speak a lot on this topic. There's a few things I want to get out of the way first and foremost. One of the things that I want to get out of the way first and foremost, because as we have discussion, as we get on like sort of minor points and so forth, it can get lost in the discussion. The first thing is I want to make it clear that even if a concrete conclusion is not reached by either me or this class, that I want to be crystal clear that the Bible is most consistent with a young earth. The exact date of the earth, maybe not so much, but definitely a young earth, okay? So I want to make that crystal clear. And the other thing I want to make crystal clear is going to come from Scripture. So it's interesting that the topic, if you look at the brochure, the topic is creation versus evolution. Would someone turn to Genesis 1:1 for me? And just read the first sentence out loud when you have it, whoever has it. Or if you have it memorized, just raise your hand and recite it for us.
In the beginning,
Dave?
God created the heavens and the earth.
I am so glad I had this week. We're done. Thanks. If you have any questions? No. I mean, really, that's it, right? We believe the Bible. We believe the Bible is true. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There is no creation versus evolution in our minds, right? That does not exist, okay? What may surprise you to hear is that doesn't really exist for the scientist either. So what are we doing? What's the debate? Why are people so emotional about this topic? You might be surprised to hear that most scientists have no problem at all with the idea of creation. That's not even the debate that we're having. And so, because of that, our conversations on this topic tend to go awry. And so I'm hoping to equip you with some ideas because this whole class, the Sunday school class, is about engaging the culture. And so I want us to be able to have conversations with atheists, with scientists, with lay people who think they're scientists that maybe aren't, people who like to play gotcha. So I'm hoping to do that. But I don't think it would be appropriate to get into this without first sort of giving you my testimony. How did I get here? So as mentioned, I had a love of science from a very early age. I think I was in 5th or 6th grade when I first learned about atoms. And I said, wow, that's cool. I am going to grow up and be a scientist. And then when I first learned about genetics, I said, I am going to grow up and be a geneticist. And I said, this is so cool. The idea that this like code tells you what you're going to look like, how things are going to form. This is just way too cool. And I said, I am going to be a geneticist. And I'm one of the apparently somewhat rare people that, other people exist that do that, but that was it, beeline, that's what I did. And just to let you know some of the struggles along the way, high school was a breeze for me for whatever reason. It was something, I was a good test taker, I was able to get through it without any problem. So I got a little cocky. And when I got into college, I thought I was going to breeze through college too. And I always had it in mind I was going to go to grad school and become this geneticist, right? And I get into college, and first year was a breeze, just like I thought it would be. So now, guess what age I am? 19, very good. Those of you that follow Pastor Van's age of 19. So one of the classes that I had to take was calculus. And I was good in math up to this point. And I got cocky. I didn't actually have to take this calculus class. I could have taken statistics, which would have meshed better with my science degree. But I said, nah, I'll take the calculus. I'll show them, and then it'll give me more options. And I didn't do very well. And so I'm getting towards the end of the year, and I'm getting concerned because I'm thinking about my GPA, and I'm thinking about graduate school. So I went to see a counselor, and I didn't get very good advice. I said, look, I need to be able to replace this on my GPA. How can I do that? Well, as far as I know, the only way you can do that is to flunk the course. So what do you think I did? I intentionally flunked it. That never goes away from your transcript. So any of you younger people here today, just keep that in mind. That never goes away from your transcript. I don't care what a counselor tells you. And so then I retook it. And because I'd already had it, as we're taking the class, I know all this stuff already. It's really not a big deal. And so I stopped going to class. Yeah, so then I ended up with a D+, okay? And then I said, well, I am tenacious, right? So I'm just like, I'm going to take this again, and I'm going to give it everything I've got. And so that I can concentrate fully on it, I'm going to take it as a summer course. Oh, you guys already know. Yeah. So summer class is condensed. You don't have as much time. So I did. I gave it everything I had, and I managed a C+. Now, how do you think grad school is going to look at that? Yeah, so I was a little concerned about my future at this point. And so I was thinking, and I was still pretty good in science. I was doing well in my genetics classes and all my science classes. And I said, what can I do? And so I'm talking to some professors, and they say, well, you could try to get involved in research. And so I started going lab to lab begging to get involved in research. Nah, you're an undergrad, we're not interested. No. A lot of no's, but I just kept going until finally somebody said, well, I could use a dishwasher in the sequencing lab. And I said, fine, I'll take it. It's experience in a lab, I'll take it, I'll go wash dishes for the sequencing lab. And as you might imagine with the scientific process, it was 30 washes in this kind of water, 30 washes in this kind of water, and 10 washes in this kind of water, and then put it on the rack, and it was really tedious, And so I did it. And I, was doing that job. I was also working at Montgomery Ward, if you guys remember those, full-time, while I was taking classes full-time. And the professor that was over the sequencing lab saw that I was a pretty hard worker and pretty diligent. Next thing you know, you're pretty good in genetics. You could be a teaching assistant for the genetics class. So then I did that. And I just kept working hard. My grades started coming back up, and the focus started coming back. And then finally, he relented and said, okay, you can do undergraduate research in my lab. And so I was able to do that, and I did some research, and that got me in position to get into graduate school. I took the GRE, the test for graduate school, did well on it. And then with those other experiences, they started seeing the F and the D plus as something that I overcame versus, a black mark, which was good. So try and try again, right? But as you may know, in that coursework, what class did I have to take? Evolution. In fact, I had to take more than one evolution class. I had to take a few evolution classes. And evolution is a given in the scientific community. It is a given the same way that the laws of physics are a given. It's a given the same way that chemical reactions are a given. It's the same way that any hard science that you can think of. It's just a given. It's an assumption that is built in. I say that so that you hopefully will have compassion on the scientist and understand that anybody who goes into science not knowing, right, not knowing the Bible, not knowing God, is going to have this as a given, a built-in assumption. And what happens if you go several years with a built-in assumption? How easy is it to overcome that assumption? It's not very easy. So I just want to give you that. And we're going to get into the meat of it a little bit more later, but there's also a lot more that goes hand in hand with evolution. In fact, a lot of science, it's almost like all they think about, right? So for graduate school, for example, I worked on chromosomes. That's what DNA is wrapped up in, for those of you that don't know. And at the center of it is a centromere. And the centromere is the dividing point. So when a cell divides, the chromosomes line up, and it's at the centromere that they divide. So it's a pretty important piece of DNA. So I was studying the centromere, and the sequences that I was looking at, we were looking for the sequence that was in common for all the centromeres. Didn't find it, but it was kind of cool that the one I found was specific just to this one chromosome, and that made it really interesting. So I was able to have a project and write papers. But what do you think we had to discuss in the paper?
Evolution.
Evolution. Well, where did this centromere come from? And is it in sorghum? Is it in these other plants? So I was studying corn. I was studying maize. Is it in sorghum and all these other related plants? See the built-in assumption? They have to be related, right? And so that's science in a nutshell. Everything kind of comes back to that for whatever reason. It just does. And that's the framework from which they operate. So when I came to faith, moved to the DC area. Some of you have heard my story, but maybe a lot of you haven't. I had been married before. I was going through a divorce. Brand new career. I was going from being a research scientist to a patent examiner. And I'm a Midwest guy. So the biggest city I had lived in prior to going to the Washington, D.C. area was Peoria, Illinois, which is not a fun place to live, I got to tell you. No offense to anybody that's been there or loves it, but it felt like it had all the negatives of the big city and none of the positives of the small town. It wasn't very warm. People, anyway. And so I come to this area, and this is hard to make all these changes at the same time. And I could not pay my attorney because, hey, cost of living is a little different in the DC area than it was in the Midwest. And I couldn't pay my attorney, and I was broken. I was done. I just fell to my knees, and I said, I can't do this by myself. And I felt this presence, and it was not an audible voice, but it's like, you're not by yourself, and you've never been by yourself. And I knew Jesus in that moment, right then and there. And I started getting into Bible studies. I started going to church. I started trying to get into the Word. And there were two things that I could not bring myself to touch. One was a pastor that wanted to meet with me immediately because he knew I was going through a divorce. And I didn't want that stopped. So I didn't want to meet with him. You guys can understand that probably. Not the best reaction on my part, but that's what I did. And evolution, the age of the earth. There were people that talked about a young earth. And in just transparency for you guys, I thought they were ignorant fools. I really did. I just said, oh my gosh, well, I can't get in with that lot, right? Come on, the science is clear, because I thought it was. And so as time went on, God healed a lot of things. So with the divorce did finalize. But after the divorce was finalized and I met a young woman that most of you know and love, LaTanya, as we were preparing to get married, I had the incredible blessing of having a pastor who recognized the difficulty in the situation and said, before I marry you guys, you must go back to your ex-wife. You must apologize for your part in the divorce. You must tell her you became a Christian. You must tell your story and ask for forgiveness. Because as you mature in Christ, you're going to be convicted to do it anyway. And if you have to do it after you have a family and everything, it could be disruptive to that situation. So I did. And she said, don't ever contact me again, you whatever. And the pastor said, you did your part. Okay, we're good. We'll move on and go forward. And sure enough, he was right. So later on, as I matured in my faith, that conviction hit very hard. And I was so thankful that he had me do that so that was a closed chapter. So how did I get here? Like, I'm in this church and I'm telling you that I had this outlook of ignorant fools on young earth, and I just got through telling you, I want to be clear, that the Bible is most consistent with the young earth. And eventually I'm going to tell you that the scientific evidence is too, but it was, and I meant to bring the book so I could show you guys, and I apologize, I forgot to do that. One of my friends in church said, have you ever watched the movie Evolution's Achilles Heels? Because he knew my position on this. I said, no. Why would I watch that? And he's just like, would you please? I mean, he's almost pleading with me. Would you just do it with an open mind, please? And for you, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And I didn't go in like I was going to attack this thing. I said, okay, I'm going to really work hard to have an open mind and watch this movie. And they covered 7 scientific areas. And they hit the genetics part because this is my baby, this is my wheelhouse. Genetics is something I've studied more than anything else. And every single thing the person was saying was correct. What is this? This bothers me. I can't argue with anything here. Is there something to this? And then the next section would hit. And the next section, I had no idea how minimal the fossil record actually is. I had no idea so many of these things, which you guys already know because you've been exposed to things like Answers in Genesis and Creation Institute and some of these things. But I didn't know any of this stuff. And so I said, is there a book that goes with this? Of course there's a book that went with that movie. And so I read the book and it gave me more detail and depth. And I finally came to the realization that at the very least, I had to be open-minded to a young earth because the evidence, and to me, the evidence is the most important thing. The evidence demands that I open myself back up to the possibility of a young earth. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, because again, this is about engaging the culture. So I want to equip you a little bit more to have the discussions. But before we do, there's one thing I want you to see here. And on the off chance that there's anybody here that is convinced of an old earth or convinced of evolution or convinced that things could in fact happen by chance and come together. Scientists used to have this thing called the RNA world theory. it was kind of interesting because RNA is one of the nucleic acids, but it can also act a little bit like a protein, and it can act like multiple roles. So if RNA was the only thing you had to get to, eventually it could sort of almost create a cell just from itself. Okay, that was the idea. They've dismissed that now. They don't believe that the evidence exists that that could even happen. For one thing, RNA gets degraded very easily, so it really couldn't have happened. But that's something that they would come up with. If you think cells are just globs of stuff, okay, you guys can start handing this around. This is a model of a cell. So we homeschool. I teach biology. I'm getting ready to teach at a co-op biology as well. I want you to pass this around and just look at the detail here, okay? And you'll see it's a lot more. Now, when Darwin first came up with the theory of evolution, they didn't have this. Cells did just look like globs of stuff, okay? So if you guys would pass this around and just take a look at it. Be careful because some of the pieces will come out. And so if they do, just put them back in. Just make sure all the pieces stay there, please, because I need to use this continually. The other thing I want to show you is this animation is based on everything we know about the cell as well as electron microscopy. So a lot of this is actually witnessed. These are things that are witnessed. I have been completely unclear whether this is actually an electron microscope like videoing these things. I don't think it is. I think it's an animation recreated from the things that they see. But rest assured that everything you see in this is something that's been observable or is known about the function of these particles, okay? And I think it's neat to see this. Sorry about the sound. I don't know. Can I turn it down? I know that doesn't look real, but it's real. That is real. Oh, yeah. That's how proteins are made. Okay, that's enough. You get the idea. So, what do you guys think?
Complex.
So, what if I told you, so even if you took the position that, well, okay, but there's like a little blobs and they're kind of running into things and stuff. What if I told you that in many cases, a single mutation to the DNA that encodes one of those little blobs derails the entire process? Many of those proteins are so fundamental to the cell that if they're altered even in formation a little bit, they look like little globs, but that one mutation alters the formation just a little bit and it does not function. What you don't see, because we don't even yet have the precision to see, is that they fit perfectly like a very intricate puzzle piece when they come together. And one mutation can throw the whole thing off. Okay? So it seems like the cell in and of itself is a pretty big miracle, doesn't it? Yeah.
What makes everything work? What makes it know what to do? How to
So
do all that?
So here's the thing we all have to get used to saying. I don't know. So the control center is the nucleus with the DNA, and these things are all encoded by the DNA. You think of the nucleus and the DNA like a central processing unit, and all the encoding is there. But that's not all there is to it. And as they discover more science, there's even bigger layers of regulation. When I went to school, we were taught the way a protein is made, there's a gene and it has something called exons and introns, okay? And the exons actually encode part of the polypeptide, and the introns are just this kind of loopy DNA, doesn't do anything, okay? And I remember we called it junk DNA.
Yeah.
You remember that? So we called it junk DNA, and I remember when I was in school saying, I don't believe it. And I don't believe that's junk DNA. I don't believe there's a bunch of DNA there for nothing. What we have found out since is that in some cases a single gene can actually encode up to like 20 different proteins because of the way that the introns are spliced in or out or whatever. There's all these different combinations that it can do. Sometimes the intron is part of the regulation process. If something sits on one intron, it does one thing. Different intron, it does something else. And if you mutate within the, exons, introns. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I was
Dan.
going to say, can you, at like a 90,000 foot view, like what were we watching there? You said inner life of the cells, but what, just like a really high level, what
So some of it was labeled, yeah, so some of it was labeled, those are all the processes that are happening within the cell.
Just to keep the cell living?
Just for the cell to function. Just for the cell to function. Every one of those proteins has a job. All the proteins have a tag on them that tells it exactly where to go in the cell. Okay? The microtubules that you saw that were kind of cool, that made themselves and then disassembled themselves, those are like a conveyor belt. So we used to see just particles floating around in a cell. And they weren't floating. They were actually moving on one of those conveyor belts very specifically to a part of the cell that it was tagged to go to. Okay? That is the level of organization that we're talking about here. And scientists know this. They know all this. Look at the evidence in front of them. And so you know, so compassion is important because you see it is right in front of their face. That's not random chance. There's no way. There's clear design in this. Nobody would, the highest functioning machine computer that we have, okay, doesn't even come close to the complexity of a cell. So keep that in mind. And they all had engineers and designers and so forth.
They can't recreate themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They can't regulate themselves. That's right. That's right. But what I wanted to address after kind of getting some of that out of the way, I just wanted to sort of, be convinced that this is the level of complexity that we're talking about. Why is it science versus faith? Why does that even happen? How does that even happen? How do we get there? Look at some of these quotes. I want to look at a couple of them, okay? Stephen Hawking, we don't need to go into detail on that. He just, doesn't think that God is the reason that we're here. Thinks it's the laws of physics. I'm not sure how exactly that works, but okay. He thinks it's the laws of physics. But look at, so if there was ever a scientist that's sort of in the public limelight that I think is an absolute fool, this guy is number one on my list, Neil deGrasse Tyson. He says, God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time moves on. So, but let's say somebody presents you with that. So, logic is something that we can use by itself. We don't have to know the science. We don't have to go toe-to-toe with Neil deGrasse Tyson on astrophysics, right? But what we can say is why would you assume God is only over the unknown?
Pardon?
Yeah.
What did you say?
Why would we assume God is only in domain over the unknown? So he's labeling God as the unknown here. Well, that doesn't really make sense, and that's not what we're saying, right? So if it's not what we're saying, what does that even mean? I love this one too. The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. What is science? What is it? Does anybody know? Does anybody?
Knowledge.
Knowledge, method of discovery, it's both of those things. So science is true, a method of discovery is true? That doesn't really make sense, does it?
Well, it's a commitment to naturalism. That's the other
Yeah.
thing. Science is committed to having physical explanations of everything.
That's correct. Yeah. So the idea that it's true, was introns being junk DNA true? Would it not have been described as science at the time I learned it? As a matter of fact, we have a long history of finding out things that we had thought were true were not. Now, we're lucky. In the case of introns, they're totally willing to accept that they were wrong on that and move on and change the model. Guess what they're not willing to accept?
God's in charge of it.
Exactly. Exactly. So I want to go through this. So some of this is me. I'm going to be going off of this a little bit, but these notes hopefully will help you. You can take these home and look through these. So if I don't go word for word through this, you'll understand it's because I want to have as good a conversation as we can have in the time that we have. Really, faith and science shouldn't be versus, okay? Science actually, at its ideal, when it's working the way it's supposed to, is supposed to be a pursuit of truth. If we're looking to explain how things work, we don't want to lie. We want the truth to how things work. So science at its ideal should be looking to discover the truth about how things work in the physical realm. Faith, we're also pursuing truth, just in the spiritual realm. So those go together really well. And in fact, Christianity and science went together really well for a long, long time. So what did happen? Where did we go off the rails? Where did we get to the point where we could have an official for the government literally lying to you about what the science behind something is and be okay with that? Because I guarantee you, when I was in graduate school, that was not okay. We had to take an ethics class. It was paramount. There was a virtue in science when I was taking it. I'm not saying they weren't atheistic at that time. I'm just saying there was a virtue in being truthful. And I think that has kind of gone by the wayside. But it makes sense when you look at the gradual decay that is happening. So what happened? What is evolution? I think evolution is what happened. Okay? The theory of evolution is what happened. Who first started talking about evolution? It was not Darwin. This may surprise some of you. It's actually a guy by the name of Lamarck. And I don't know if I put his full name on there. Somewhere down there I think I did. Yes. I'm not going to say his full name. It's just Lamarck as far as I'm concerned. He's got like 6 names in there. Let's back up. Let's define evolution first. I think that's really important, and we can come back at the end and define evolution again. Who can tell me what they think evolution is? What is the definition of evolution, or what do you think evolution is? Yes?
The theory of evolution relies on the belief that life began as a chance combination of non-living things.
Thank you, and that's exactly what I was hoping to get. That is in line with, I think, what most Christians think of when they think of evolution. Does anybody have an alternative definition of evolution?
What that definition was,
Not precisely. You want to speak up?
I have it memorized from our homeschool co-op.
Okay.
The theory of evolution relies on the belief that life began as a chance combination of non-living things.
Chance combination of non-living things.
Is there a simpler definition that separates itself from a point of creation? So rather than saying, I don't know, we came from stardust, but
Right.
rather that over time, organisms adapt and change into more complex organisms?
You got it. So in the scientific realm, it was never that. So it became that, but it was never that. It was never that life came from nothing or chance encounters. Evolution was actually the progression, mutation, transformation of a simpler life form to a more complex life form. And Lamarck was actually one of the first ones to have a cogent theory around this. He believed in God. I'm not going to go so far as to call him a Christian. I don't know him. He's from way back then. But he believed in God. And Lamarck did believe, in fact, that the species or the different types were created. Okay, he believed in a creator. The different types were created. And then Lamarck actually postulated that there was something called adaptation and change. Okay, things that we can observe today. So he believed that there's adaptation and change. Unfortunately for Lamarck, and unfortunately for us as Christians, we can't look up to him too much, because he did believe, though, that simpler life forms would evolve or become more complicated and over time, which I don't think the evidence is there for that, by the way. Yes?
The key concept to philosophical evolution is, and the terms that we use to describe the process of evolution sugarcoat it, because the key concept behind evolution is that it's undirected, and that when you watch popularizers like Tyson,
Yeah.
they will throw in words that imply that evolution has a motive force behind it.
That, isn't that interesting? They sure do.
You cannot have any emotive force.
That's right.
Philosophically consistent with evolution. It
Right.
must be completely random, which destroys the terminology that we use when we talk about evolution. Because we use things like adaptation as though there's a progression. There cannot be any progression in evolution. It must be completely random.
Yeah. So that's what Darwin did to the topic. So Darwin was really the first one who came in and assumed no creator, no God. That was Darwin that did that. And so he came up with the theory of evolution. But before we get to that, I do want to say scientists' view of evolution, okay, is not what you said, not what Amanda said either. A scientist's view of evolution is that it is a very large generic field of study, okay? And what they believe, when you say, I don't believe in evolution, you guys, you need to hear this if you hear nothing else today. When you say, I don't believe in evolution, they think that you are rejecting every little field of study that is under that big umbrella, okay? All the way back to Marie Curie and radioisotopes, because that's been used to date things, right? So you got radioisometric dating, you have molecular genetics, Mendelian genetics, you have epigenetics, all of these things that we study in great precision and detail that brought you that video that we saw, okay? They think when you say, I don't believe in evolution, that you have rejected all of that. So I want to caution you when you're having discussions with people to be very careful about your wording. And Amanda, when you said the definition, you said theory of evolution. And I think even more important than the theory of evolution, because we do have Lamarck, and by the way, scientists are coming back to him and flocking back to him, that you say Darwin's theory of evolution. By the way, and I have it on here, what's interesting is that he published The Origin of Species, okay? And when he did that, initially, people raved about it. Why? Because no God. They really liked that, okay? And the problem was, at the same time you see here, they were discovering dinosaur bones and fossils, and then you kind of had the invention of radiometric dating. And initially, all of these things were designed to sort of support Darwin and his theory of evolution. It was sort of like, okay, in order for all those changes to take place, you're going to have a really long period of time if it's going to be by chance, right? So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and we're using math and physics to compute that. Which also, if you argue with that, you're arguing with math and physics. Understand, that's the viewpoint that you are. So what does that mean? 4.5 billion years is a long period of time. But guess what? Complex life forms, even in their model, don't show up until about 500 million years ago. So out of that 4.5 billion, 4 billion years of non-complex life forms. Take that away, okay? And in that 500 million years, like mammals don't show up until like 200 million years. So over half of that you can take away, okay? And so you get down to this condensed period of time, and what does that mean for Charles Darwin? All of a sudden you don't have that much time to work with. And furthermore, the fossil record didn't support him. There's something called the Precambrian explosion. Now, I will say this. People who debate this topic in creation circles use that term a lot. So people you talk with, they're going to be ready for it. Just understand that. They're not going to wilt when you say Precambrian explosion, Darwin had to be wrong, because they don't necessarily subscribe to Darwin. They really don't. And so, but the Precambrian explosion, that point was as all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all of these fossils with all of this complexity and all of this diversity just showed up. And so they don't really have a good explanation for that, to be honest with you. You may hear some different things, but it's sort of one of evolution's Achilles heels. Okay? So the other thing that's interesting is the fossil record is not what you think it is, more than likely. You go to a museum, go to the Smithsonian, and you see all these full skeletons of dinosaur bones and everything, and you're like, wow, they dug that out of the ground. There are a few full skeletons that they found. There are a few of those. But by and large, when you go to a museum and you see one of those, it's like half of a rib bone or something is the only actual bone. And they construct the rest of it based off of that. And from what else they've found. There's actually not nearly as many full skeleton remains as you might think. So it's a very small sample. The other thing is it's not very diverse. I mean, if we had small changes over time adding up to this thing, you would think that we would have a lot more diversity than what we see. Why could we group things like a Triceratops and a T-Rex and a Hadrosaurus? There's not really that many dinosaurs when you think about it. And you sort of look at it and you're like, well, the complexity isn't... You would expect the complexity to be several-fold larger than the species complexity we see today, because you'd have all those transitions, all those different things that would arrive there. We should see lots of different things, but we don't. So it's sort of interesting. But here's what happened. So why did Darwin not go away? Darwin didn't go away because, one, it was an atheistic view, and they really liked that. So what they started to do is when genetics became a field of study, they put that under evolution. Why? Because pretty much, there's a little debatable on viruses, but pretty much everything that's living has what? DNA. So genetics, it has genetics in common. You think about it, when somebody wants to test paternity, what do? DNA test. It means if it's positive, it means they're related. Yeah, you're the father, right? Means that you're related. And so now we've got these terms that we can use saying, well, look, if I can match up a certain percentage of this DNA with this DNA, well, they're related. I worked for a guy who is the author of the Yeast Handbook. He was responsible for calling this different species of yeast. I developed molecular markers for him so that we could say, this is this species of yeast, this is this species of yeast, all based on DNA differences. Okay? But where did that assumption come from? Is that even testable? Because if you look at even people, yeah, you have somebody, you are the father. We also have the Maury Povich, you are not the father, right? Too many DNA differences. Not related. Oh, you notice they don't fixate on that part. They don't say a plant is not related to a person. Quite the opposite. Why don't they say a plant is not related? You would think that wouldn't be very hard. But they don't. Why? Because we share some DNA with plants. From their viewpoint, right? So there are genes and proteins, because plants have cells too. You saw the inner workings of a cell. Plant cell looks slightly different, but there's a lot of similarities there, a lot of similar functions. So now you get to a place where, I'm sorry, I get enthusiastic about this topic, so I was thinking it would be too short. And no, that's not happening. So I apologize. But anyway, you get to a place where through DNA similarities, that's now evolution. And now that we're getting into the molecular fields and the different fields like this, everything starts tying to evolution. Like I said with my research, how does this play into evolution? Can we make a story out of evolution? How are these things related? The assumption is that they're related. Why is that an assumption? So that's a good question to ask people that assume that. Well, why would that be your assumption? Okay? And so I had a conversation just the other day with a coworker who is an atheist. and we were talking, and I used the analogy of cars manufactured by different makers with different engineers and everything. And I say, look, it's a combustible engine. They have iron in them. They have, they have all this, all of this. You would think that they're related, but they're not related. He says, but they have a designer. I said, exactly. But it's true, right? So just because they use the same material doesn't mean that they're related. And that's the same with organisms. Just because they have some of the same material doesn't mean they're related. Now, other important things to get to is that scientists will not debate the point of origin with you. Okay? Even Stephen Hawking, towards the end of his life, said, we don't really know where life came from. It could have come from a space rock from outer space. And of course, that leads to the question, well, where did that come from? We know that, okay? But understand, they're okay saying we don't know. It's interesting. It's almost like we will accept any explanation except for God. Well, that's an interesting position to take for a scientist, don't you think?
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That scientists are willing to say we don't know, but when you get into the general population and into the educational programs, it's a given.
Yeah.
So where's that divide?
Yeah.
How come the I don't know doesn't trickle into?
Well, I think you're seeing the work of the enemy. I think you are seeing the work of the enemy. And part of that is if you go to the Smithsonian right now, you'll go into the Natural History Museum, and when I went to grad school, here is how we would normally do this, okay? You would see the little placard, and here's this little tiny mammal, little shrew-looking thing, and it would say, in the language that I learned in grad school, according to our best evidence, this appears to be the oldest ancestor of all mammals, which would include us, something like that. That is not what that placard says in the Smithsonian. Do you know what it says? Oh, look, this is your relative. I don't know if it says it in exactly those words, but that's what it says. This is your relative. This is your ancestor. It says that. Why? That's not even, scientifically sound that they do it. Yeah.
I think it falls back to where Bill Nye calls science a religion, and today it's treated that way.
Well, look at Bill Nye's quote. I really believe in science. It is a faith. It is a reverence akin to religion, but as we always say, it's different from religion. Hold on, this is really interesting. In that, as near as we can tell, it exists outside of us. What's his view of religion there? He's basically saying religion is just man-created. That it doesn't exist outside of us. Well, that's not what we believe, obviously. And it has an objective quality, the process of science. At least he calls it a process at the end of the quote. As most people treat it as this living, breathing thing almost. So I think I did want some time for some healthy discussion. I'm going to go over one last thing. And again, the handout has some other things. There's some tough questions at the end that I want you guys to think about, but they're tough questions. Yes?
You have about 10 minutes or so.
Oh, yes. I'm just, if there's not discussion, I'll fill it in. Don't worry.
There will be discussion.
Yeah, I just want to leave some time for that, yeah. So one of the things that is an interesting, somewhat recent discovery is the discovery of soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Now, I will say that a lot of Christians will pummel the scientific community with that. They have answers to that. So I kind of looked that up because I remember Mary Schweitzer was the one who discovered this. I think it was NC State. Mary Schweitzer discovered this, and when she discovered it, is immediately heralded that, dinosaurs might not be as old as we think they are. What do you think happened to Mary Schweitzer? There's almost this immediate rush to blackball her as a scientist. So what do you think she did? Because she's not a Christian.
She changed her view so that
She didn't actually. So what she did is and this is what they do, she moved it a little bit. So it's sort of like, it's soft tissue in dinosaur bones, that's great. Carbon dating, we're not even, yeah, carbon dated between 20 and 30,000 years, but we're going to say it was preserved, so that carbon reading means nothing, okay? Because carbon dating, if you contaminate it or something like that, the reading is not accurate. So we're just going to ignore the carbon dating. And we're going to now discover, why was this soft tissue preserved so well? So she dedicated the next decade plus of her research career looking for what might have preserved that soft tissue longer than they previously expected. And she found the answer. And it's iron particles. And so the iron particles were, they believe, were able to just fully preserve this soft tissue such that, that you could see now soft tissue. But these are still hundreds of millions of years old. It's just that the soft tissue is well preserved by a preservative we didn't know was there. Okay? Interestingly enough, that they carbon date mummies that are preserved. Now, there could be an explanation for that. It could be that they take the organic material from the wrapping itself and, nothing that was part of the embalming. I don't know. Be careful with that. Be careful going down those avenues. But they're good questions to ask. If you're telling me that a mummy that is 5,000 years old is carbon dated to 5,000 years old based on organic material that has been carbon tested, what's that organic material? And why wouldn't the carbon dating on the organic material from the soft tissue be valid? I think that's a tough question for them to answer, especially given that they've tested a lot of these samples and they're pretty consistently going between 20 and 30,000 years old. So if you're getting consistency, why would you question it? If it was wrong, if it was an error, you'd expect it all over the place. So, yeah.
So did that research then that asserted the conclusion that iron acted as a preservative, is that conclusive?
Well, I think in the community it is. I think it's, if you look up papers, you'll see a lot of papers on it. But isn't that yet another example of, we didn't think soft tissue could last this long. Ah, surprise. Any answer other than we're wrong about the date. Do you see how that works?
Yeah, that's right.
And radiometric dating of rocks, which is the most inconsistent and least reliable of all the radiometric dating process. Carbon is the most reliable, by the way. I know you hear carbon dating is not reliable. There's some truth to that, but please understand of the radiometric dating options, that is the most reliable. And the reason it is the most reliable is because it is for the time period where we have written history. And so we're able to validate a lot of those things. So it is actually the most reliable. So this is not a disadvantage when you see soft tissue of dinosaur bones being between 20 and 30,000 years old. You may think of it as a disadvantage because that's not 6,000 or 7,000, but it's not a disadvantage. Because for those telling you that dinosaurs are 200 million years old, what is their answer? What is their explanation for that? I don't think they're going to have one. Other than saying, well, the tissue is preserved and so the dating doesn't work. Well, what about the consistency? Okay? So that's just something to keep in mind. I also want to leave you with this, and that is, because I was a dishwasher in the sequencing lab, I got very familiar with DNA sequencing. Many processes in science work this way. Any of these tools that we use work this way. And it doesn't have to be in science. It could be in engineering and other things as well. You guys will be well familiar with this. When you have a process, at the beginning of the process, it's unreliable reads. And then you get to the place where it's reliable and you can reliably read the DNA sequence. And then at the end of the process, it's unreliable. Whenever you test the boundaries of a test, you're going to get unreliable results, whether it's at the beginning or the end. Readings all over the place can lead you in the wrong direction if you're a scientist, if you take those in and believe them. So if I'm at the beginning of the read, say, creation of the earth, okay, might I not have readings all over the place? Because our test isn't going to be able to determine where we're at when it comes to creation. And we also don't know the processes that God used for the creation process. How rapid they were, instantaneous. There's a lot of things that could make our earth look really old when it's not. And so I just wanted to leave you with that and just understand that there are limits to these tests. And when you get outside of those limits or at the edge of those limits, those test results don't mean very much. Do you agree with that, David?
I'm sorry?
Would you agree with that? You do tests. Would you agree with that?
I compare fingerprints. I can do a lot of tests.
That's testing. That's testing. When the fingerprint's kind of smudgy,
Yeah.
it's a lot less certain, right? Yeah.
There's enough there.
So, okay. Any questions, any comments, anything? Yeah, Adam.
Could you define Mendelian genetics and epigenetics?
Oh, yes, we didn't even get to talk about epigenetics. I'm sorry about that. So, epigenetics is, so first of all, Mendelian genetics, we'll just get that out of the way. Gregor Mendel was a monk who discovered a simple, what I would call simple genetics through peas. And so he was able to determine that simple gene inheritance, which means you get this copy of a gene, you get this result. You get this copy of the gene, you get this result. And he also discovered dominant and recessive. You guys are fairly familiar with that. Blue eyes are recessive, blonde hair is recessive. You don't see it as much, right? So that's Mendelian genetics. It's simple gene inheritance. It might not surprise you to hear that there's not a lot of Mendelian genetics. A lot of genetics is very complex. And so, but Mendelian genetics is very simple. Epigenetics is not simple at all, because epigenetics is the regulation of genes where the genes are the exact same sequence. The exact same sequence. But they do something different based on methylation patterns in the DNA. And so what ends up happening is they get expressed or not expressed based on whether the DNA unfolds or stays folded up. And that is controlled by a methylation process that's still not completely or fully understood. But that's what's called epigenetics. And so you don't always get the results you expect to see when you're studying that trait, because you have epigenetics which is involved. And epigenetics actually, and this can go back, if you guys want to look this up, Lamarck actually was the first one who even talked about this. Something you experience in your life can actually imprint into your genetics through epigenetics and be passed on to the next generation.
Wow.
Unfortunately, our best example of this is for basically lewd behavior.
Basically what?
Lewd behavior. It is true that somebody who looks at pornography, for example, they know now that there's a protein that is changed as a result of that overstimulation, and that actually can be passed on to the kids. And then those kids will have a bigger challenge then when it comes to purity as a result of that. Yeah, sad that that's our example, but it is. And so anyway, so this epigenetics stuff is just fascinating. Yeah.
Grant, just as you said that, it made me think of Jesus' words where he talks about a man sitting in his household, and then he resists, and then he gives in. And while he's resisting, there's a demon that goes and gets many more demons to try to come into his household and cause him to sin. And I just think, what you just said is very scary. And it's a good warning to us men that we need to fight for purity, not for our sake, but for our families.
Yeah, well, I think it's the body of a church fight. I think, yes, men have to take the lead role in it, but I think it's a body of the church fight because, I know we're off topic now, but I do think that it is, because understanding how it works and understanding God's plan is for everybody. And there is brain chemistry involved, there is epigenetics involved, and when you understand how all those things work together for God's plan in that arena, it's eye-opening and amazing, and I think it may even help with kids and educating them and helping them to understand. It isn't just because I say so, because the Bible says so. Because that's hard. That's hard for a kid to just take like that. And so it's like, no, it's actually more. And here's why. Here's what happens, you know. That's another topic for another day, though. Yeah.
Brett, I'm just curious about how you handle evangelizing or sharing faith with coworkers that are atheists. Obviously, you have greater insight to the scientific world to be able to understand that, but a lot of, you know, well, why can't they see this, right? I think
Yeah.
Romans 1, God's handed them
Yeah.
over, right? I think there's going to be a lot of it for us that, you know, even though we're able to speak to certain things in the scientific community, that their eyes are just not open because God's not allowing their eyes to
So
open.
I take a long period of time with slow changes over that long period of. but really. But I do. It's just a little bit at a time.
So the change evolves over time.
Yeah. No, really, but I do mean that. What I do is I work to establish a relationship with that person. I make my views clear to that person. And then I very carefully discuss what they're open to discussing and back off of things that they're not open to discussing. Because if we were to have a debate, right, and I feel like I've won the debate, no. You've lost. They've shut down. They don't care. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and they lose in the process too. So, you know, and not that it's, you know, I think God is sovereign over all of that. Our time is up. If anybody else has questions at the end, I'm happy to have those, but I do want to release you guys to the next session. Thank you.